At 50, the reality of absolute surrender does not happen on a manicured green fairway. It happens in the back of a police cruiser in the dead of night. In late March of 2026, the blinding red and blue strobe lights of a Martin County Sheriff's vehicle cut brutally through the Florida darkness. A heavy Range Rover lay flipped on its side near the affluent estates of Jupiter Island. And there, draped in a thin, humiliating sheet, sat Tiger Woods, the most ruthlessly disciplined, mentally impenetrable athlete in modern human history, was shivering. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils extremely dilated. The police body camera captured a scene of devastating, absolute defeat. This was a man in deep, chronic physical agony, wincing and involuntarily hiccuping as the cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. With 2 tiny capsules of synthetic numbness sitting in his pocket, he looked up at the officer, his voice stripped of all its former imperial command, and asked a question that shattered the illusion of his invincibility. "I'm being arrested?" He blew 000s for alcohol. He was not drunk. He was simply trying to escape the unbearable, grinding torture of his own fused spine and shattered legs. Now, publicly embarrassed and ashamed, he has fled the United States entirely, checking into a remote treatment facility to hide from the wreckage of a body and a life that have completely lost control. How does a child prodigy, engineered from birth for absolute, flawless perfection, end up repeatedly crashing into the dark edges of his own existence? What is the agonizing psychological cost of forcing a human skeleton to swing a golf club until the bones literally collapse? And when the cheering crowds vanish, the mother who anchored him dies, and the painkillers finally wear off, who is left to rescue the fallen king from the wreckage of his own design? Before we examine the twisted metal of his latest collapse, we must return to the pristine grass where the illusion of absolute control first began. Because to understand a man shivering in the police car, you must first know the boy who was commanded to be a god. The architecture of absolute control begins with a single, perfectly manicured blade of grass. To understand the agonizing disintegration of the man sitting in the back of a police cruiser, you must first step onto the flawless, emerald green fairways of his youth. Picture a golf course at dawn. The air is thick with the scent of damp soil, morning dew, and chemical fertilizers. There's absolutely no chaos here. Every grain of sand in the bunker is raked into identical, sweeping lines. Every blade of grass is cut to a precise, uniform millimeter. This is not just a playing field. It is a sterile, green cage, and it was the only world where he was ever truly allowed to exist. He was not raised, he was engineered. Long before he could comprehend the crushing weight of global fame, the boy was subjected to an alchemy of military discipline and unconditional, yet fiercely demanding parental devotion. His father, Earl Woods, a former Green Beret who served tours in Vietnam, did not view golf as a leisurely pursuit. He viewed it as psychological warfare. Earl would purposely drop golf bags, jingle coins, and shout while his young son was at the peak of his backswing. He was training a soldier to become entirely immune to the unpredictable noises of the human world. He was forging a mind that could not be distracted, could not be intimidated, and could not be broken. But if Earl provided the armor, it was his mother, Kultida, who forged the psychological spine. A fierce, uncompromising woman from Thailand, Kultida possessed a gaze that could seemingly bend steel. She was the absolute anchor of his universe. While the father built the athlete, the mother protected the vessel. She was the one who walked quietly outside the ropes, her eyes tracking his every movement, instilling in him a ruthless, suffocating demand for excellence. She taught him that the world outside their family unit was dangerous, unpredictable, and inherently untrustworthy. To survive, he had to rely entirely on himself. She was his ultimate tether to reality. When you are a toddler demonstrating a flawless golf swing on national television, you are no longer a child. You become a designated deity. Millions of people look at you and see the future. They see the transcendence of race. They see the absolute limits of human potential being pushed into a new stratosphere. But what they do not see is the terrifying, silent pressure building inside the mind of a boy who is never allowed to simply fail. He learned very early that love, approval, and his very identity were completely bound to the geometries of his golf swing. If he could control the precise angle of a steel club face traveling at 120 miles per hour, if he could dictate the exact aerodynamic flight of a small white sphere across 400 yards of airspace, if he could do that, he could control his destiny. He was a machine. And for over a decade, the machine functioned with a terrifying, breathtaking perfection. We all remember the Sunday afternoons, the searing heat of the late-day sun, the crisp, blinding white Nike swoosh against a blood-red shirt, the way tens of thousands of people would line the fairways, holding their collective breath in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. And then the sound. Whack. A metallic, explosive crack that echoed to pine trees, followed by the roar of the masses. He was a god walking among mortals. He won majors by unprecedented margins. He amassed a billion-dollar empire. He constructed an image of absolute, stoic invincibility. He never showed pain. He never showed fear. He simply locked his eyes on the target. His pupils dilated with a predatory focus, and he executed the mechanics of his design. But a human body is not forged from iron and titanium. It is a fragile biological collection of tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. To generate the violent, explosive power that defined his early career, he had to subject his own anatomy to catastrophic levels of biomechanical stress. The modern golf swing is an unnatural, violent motion. He would plant his feet into the earth like concrete pillars, rotate his upper body against the resistance of his hips, and then unleash all that stored kinetic energy in a fraction of a second. The sheer, violent torque generated by that movement sent massive, shearing forces directly into his lower lumbar spine and down into his knees. He was essentially performing a controlled car crash inside his own skeletal structure, hundreds of thousands of times. The bones remember. The cartilage remembers. While the world worshipped the trophies and the red shirts, the structural integrity of the demigod was already beginning to quietly, invisibly fracture. The green cage was demanding its toll. Yet, the physical erosion was nothing compared to the psychological pressure cooker building behind his dark, impassive eyes. When you are taught that you must control everything, the ball, the wind, the crowd, the narrative, the billion-dollar corporate expectations, you are forced to compartmentalize your humanity. You lock the fear, the exhaustion, and the profound, suffocating isolation into a dark room inside your mind. You build a flawless, impenetrable mask. You marry a beautiful woman. You have beautiful children. You buy the massive estate. You construct the perfect, unblemished American dream. But perfection is a phantom. It does not exist in the natural world. The more tightly you grip the reins of an illusion, the more violently the universe will eventually tear it from your hands. You cannot engineer the chaos out of the human soul. You cannot suppress the dark, frantic desire for escape when the pressure of being a living deity becomes utterly unbearable. For 33 years, Tiger Woods maintained absolute control over his environment. He did not slip. He did not bleed. He did not let the mask slip for even a single unguarded second. But a fortress built on absolute suppression is incredibly brittle. It only takes one microscopic crack in the foundation for the entire, towering structure to violently collapse. The god of the fairways was about to discover that the world outside the manicured green grass does not obey the rules of golf. The night of Thanksgiving in 2009 was rapidly approaching. The air in Florida was about to turn incredibly cold. And the most famous, tightly controlled man on the face of the earth was about to step on the gas pedal, blindly steering his flawless life directly into a catastrophic, shattering wall. The silence was about to end. The glass was about to break. When a human being is forced to live inside a pristine, flawless glass house for 33 years, an unbearable psychological pressure begins to build. If you are never allowed to make a mistake, never allowed to be messy, and never allowed to simply be a flawed mortal, something dark and chaotic begins to germinate in the shadows of your own mind. You do not rebel by making small errors. You rebel by quietly, systematically wiring the entire glass house with explosives. The illicit affairs with nightclub waitresses and hostesses were not merely acts of infidelity. In the clinical theater of psychology, they were acts of desperate, self-destructive rebellion. The boy who was engineered to be a perfect, emotionless machine on the golf course was secretly seeking out the most chaotic, unscripted, and unpolished corners of the human experience. He was chasing a chaotic thrill simply because it was the only thing in his life that his handlers, his sponsors, and his strict upbringing could not control. But secrets have a physical weight. You can only carry them for so long before they crush the lungs. By the late days of November 2009, the weight had become entirely unsustainable. The whispers in the tabloid press were growing into a deafening roar. The pristine mask was cracking. And on the night of Thanksgiving, a holiday engineered to be the ultimate, wholesome portrait of the American family, the pressure cooker finally, violently detonated. It was 2:30 in the morning on November 27th. The sprawling, manicured suburban enclave of Windermere, Florida, was completely submerged in a heavy, silent dark. The air was incredibly still, carrying the faint, damp chill of a late autumn night. Inside the massive gated estate, the illusion of the perfect family had just been torn to shreds. The confrontation was over. The truth was out. He did not walk out of the house. He fled. When you are leaving your own driveway at 2:30 in the morning, you are not driving toward a destination. You are trying to outrun your own collapsing reality. He threw his body into the driver's seat of his heavy, black Cadillac Escalade. His breathing was shallow, frantic, entirely stripped of the icy, predatory calm that defined his Sundays on the golf course. He turned the key. The heavy engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of the neighborhood. He pressed the accelerator. For his entire life, Tiger Woods had possessed a singular, unparalleled ability to control the exact trajectory of an object. He could thread a golf ball through a narrow corridor of pine trees from 300 yards away with absolute surgical precision. But in the frantic, suffocating panic of that Florida night, he could not even keep a 5,000-pound vehicle on a wide, paved suburban street. The SUV surged forward, its tires screaming violently as they left the smooth asphalt and tore directly into the manicured grass. Time did not slow down. It fractured. The heavy front grille of the Escalade violently struck a fire hydrant. The dull, heavy thud of crushing metal echoed through the night air. The impact sheared the iron hydrant entirely off its base. A massive, pressurized geyser of cold water erupted into the dark sky, raining down on the hood of the vehicle like a sudden, chaotic monsoon. But the momentum was not spent. The vehicle lurched forward through the blinding spray of water and violently slammed into the thick trunk of a neighbor's oak tree. Crunch. The absolute, jarring violence of a sudden stop. The heavy airbags explosively deployed, filling the cabin with the acrid, choking smell of burnt gunpowder and chemical dust. The horn began to blare, a continuous, agonizing mechanical scream cutting through the upscale silence of the neighborhood. Inside the house, his wife, Elin Nordegren, heard the horrific symphony of crushing steel and rushing water. She ran out into the freezing, wet night. What followed is a sequence of events so steeped in poetic, Greek tragedy that no screenwriter could have possibly dared to invent it. To rescue her husband, trapped behind the locked doors of the crushed vehicle, Elin needed a tool. She ran back, grabbed an object, and rushed to the rear of the SUV. She raised above her head, and she swung. It was a golf club. Consider the devastating, absolute irony of this cinematic frame. The golf club, the very instrument that had elevated him to the status of a demigod. the tool that had brought him billions of dollars, universal adoration, and absolute global supremacy. The sacred wand of his empire. In the freezing dark of that Florida morning, that very same instrument was violently smashed into the rear window of his car by his betrayed wife. Smash! The tempered glass shattered into 10,000 glittering diamonds, raining down onto the wet asphalt. The sanctuary was broken. The glass house had completely collapsed. When the police and paramedics finally arrived, the scene they found was entirely stripped of any remaining dignity. The untouchable king of the sporting world was lying flat on his back on the cold, wet pavement. The geyser from the broken fire hydrant was still spraying wildly into the air, soaking the street. He was slipping in and out of consciousness. As the paramedics leaned over him, shining their harsh, blinding penlights into his dilated eyes, the physical reality of the crash became undeniably clear. The impact of the steering wheel had lacerated his face. His upper and lower lips were deeply torn. He tasted the heavy, metallic tang of his own blood pooling in his mouth. He was bleeding. For over a decade, the world had convinced itself that Tiger Woods was an immortal machine, incapable of feeling pressure, incapable of failing, and incapable of bleeding. But as he lay on the cold asphalt, with torn lips and a shattered marriage, the terrifying truth was broadcast to the entire globe. He was mortal. He was messy. He was broken. The ensuing weeks were a spectacle of public ruin. The corporate sponsors, who had built their entire brand identities on his aura of flawless perfection, fled with breathtaking speed. The press dismantled his private life piece by piece, exposing the dark, desperate rebellion he had hidden for so long. He was forced to stand in front of a blue curtain, staring into a sea of camera lenses, and publicly apologize to his mother, his wife, and the world. He lost millions. He lost his family. He lost his absolute control. But the universe is a profoundly cruel and meticulous accountant. Public humiliation is merely a psychological punishment. It fades with time. People forget. Apologies are accepted, and PR teams eventually rebuild the narrative. The true punishment, the one that cannot be negotiated with a press conference or settled in a divorce court, was waiting silently in the dark. For years, his physical body had endured the catastrophic, violent torque of his unearthly golf swing. It had borne the weight of his obsessive, military-style physical training. It had watched his psychological world collapse on that Thanksgiving night. And now, the body decided it was time to collect its debt. The fire hydrant and the oak tree had only bruised his face. But deep inside his skeletal structure, beneath the heavy layers of muscle, the foundational pillars of his physical existence were quietly beginning to crumble. The glass had shattered. Now, the bones were about to follow. Public humiliation is a brutal storm, but storms eventually run out of rain. The cameras inevitably pack up, the tabloid ink dries, and the masses find new tragedy to consume. Tiger Woods rebuilt his public image. He clawed his way back onto the manicured grass. He smiled for the sponsors. He won again. But while the world was willing to forgive his psychological transgressions, his own anatomy was completely, mercilessly unforgiving. For decades, his lower back had acted as the central shock absorber for the most violent, explosive, and unnatural athletic motion ever perfected by a human being. Every single time he drove a golf ball into the horizon, his lumbar spine was forced to absorb a massive, shearing wave of kinetic energy. The L4 and L5 vertebrae, the foundational load-bearing pillars of the human core, were repeatedly ground together under impossible torque. The human spine is not an iron suspension bridge. It is a fragile stack of bone and soft cartilage. And by the time the calendar turned to the mid-2020s, the cartilage had completely surrendered. It did not happen with the sudden, cinematic violence of a car crash. It happened in the quiet, agonizing dark of his own bedroom. Nerve pain is not like a lacerated lip or a broken arm. It does not bleed. It does not swell. It is a silent, invisible torture chamber. It manifests as a heavy, suffocating ache that radiates down the legs, a sudden, blinding electrical shock that fires through the hips without warning. It is the kind of pain that steals your dignity before it steals your mobility. The man who used to confidently stride up the 18th fairway at Augusta National, wearing his iconic red shirt while the earth trembled beneath the roar of the crowd, now found himself unable to tie his own shoes without his breath hitching in his throat. He could not bend down to pick up a golf tee. He could not sit in a chair. He could not escape the cage of his own decaying biology. By September of 2025, the agony had reached an absolute critical threshold. The space inside his spinal canal had narrowed so severely that the nerves were being physically crushed. He was forced back onto the cold, sterile surgical table. The surgeons performed a microdecompression of the lumbar nerve root. It was an invasive, desperate attempt to carve out just a little more space for the inflamed nerves to breathe. It was a 6th back surgery in 10 years. Think about the sheer, terrifying desperation of that statistic. 6 times, he willingly allowed surgeons to slice into his back, to scrape away bone and scar tissue, simply chasing the phantom hope of a pain-free morning. But the microdecompression was not enough. The structural collapse was too profound. Just 1 month later, in October 2025, the pain came roaring back, fiercer and more unyielding than before. The L4 and L5 discs had severely collapsed. The spine was literally bone grinding against bone. He flew to a specialized clinic in New York, his body rigid, his jaw clenched, heavily reliant on a synthetic chemical veil just to endure the flight. The operating room in New York was a theater of cold, absolute clinical precision. Under the heavy, suffocating blanket of general anesthesia, the doctors did not just shave bone this time. They gutted the failing architecture entirely. They reached into the center of his spine, removed the destroyed, flattened disc, and forcibly wedged a rigid, artificial replacement between his vertebrae. Metal and synthetic plastic were implanted directly into the core of the greatest athlete of a generation. When he woke up, staring at the sterile ceiling of the recovery room, the ticking of the monitors echoed the slow, creeping realization in his mind. The surgeons had fixed the mechanics, but they could not turn back the clock. The pristine, indestructible machine engineered by his father was gone forever. Months later, speaking to a journalist, the carefully constructed facade of the invincible tiger finally cracked. He did not offer the usual, defiant athletic rhetoric about grinding or making a comeback. Instead, he offered a quiet, devastatingly honest confession. "Sometimes I'm good," he murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with golf. "Sometimes a whole day is bad. Replacing a disc is not easy. A whole day is bad." There is profound, crushing poetry in those words. The man who used to dictate the exact spin of a golf ball from 200 yards away was now completely at the mercy of his own inflamed nervous system. He could not plan his schedule. He could not promise he would play. He simply had to wake up every morning, swing his legs over the edge of bed, and wait to see if his own spine would grant him permission to stand. For those of you watching this, who have crossed the threshold into the later chapters of life, you understand this silent betrayal better than anyone. Have you ever looked in a mirror and felt a deep, irreconcilable disconnect between the vibrant, youthful energy in your mind and the heavy, aching reality of the bones carrying you? What happens to a person's soul when the body simply refuses to carry the load anymore? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because the loneliness of chronic physical pain is a universal exile. Tiger Woods was exiled to his sprawling estate in Florida, surrounded by his trophies, his millions, and an impenetrable wall of isolation. He retreated into the shadows, managing the persistent ache in his back, hoping that the artificial disc in his spine would be the final, necessary toll paid to the universe. He thought he had endured the absolute worst of his physical trials. He thought the heavy metal fused into his back would be enough to appease the fates. He was incredibly, tragically wrong. The universe was not finished dismantling the demigod. The spine was merely the structural foundation. Now, it was time to shatter the pillars. The calendar was slowly inching toward a cool, misty morning in Los Angeles. He was about to get behind the wheel of another heavy SUV, and the violence of the crash awaiting him on the steep, winding curves of the canyon would make the fire hydrant in Florida look like a child's game. The glass had broken. The spine had collapsed. Now, the heavy iron of the chassis was about to crush the bone. When the fates decide to completely break a man, they do not announce their arrival. They wait for a Tuesday morning. They wait for a clear sky. They wait for a moment of completely mundane, ordinary routine. It was February 23rd, 2021. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale, golden light over the affluent, winding roads of the Rolling Hills Estates in Los Angeles County. The air was cool and sharp. Tiger Woods was behind the wheel of a heavy, courtesy Genesis GV80 SUV, driving down a steep, notorious stretch of Hawthorne Boulevard. The road curved sharply, dropping down the canyon side. He was driving fast. Too fast. For a man who had spent his entire life mastering the exact geometry of angles, speed, and trajectory, the sudden, absolute loss of physical mechanics was a violent, catastrophic paradox. The heavy SUV drifted across the center median. Time, as it always does in the face of sudden violence, stretched into a long, suffocating crawl. The massive vehicle clipped a wooden sign, shattering it into splinters. It crossed two oncoming lanes of traffic. Completely out of control, it hit the curb, and then the 5,000-pound machine launched entirely into the air, surrendering completely to the merciless, indifferent laws of gravity. The vehicle rolled. The interior cabin became a terrifying, chaotic centrifuge of deploying airbags, shattering safety glass, and crushing metal. The roof buckled. The heavy steel chassis groaned and twisted under the immense kinetic force. As the SUV tumbled violently down the hillside, resting finally on its side deep in the brush, the crushing weight of the engine block and collapsing dashboard drove directly into the lower half of his body. The silence that followed the crash was absolute and terrifying. When the first responders arrived, looking down at the mangled, unrecognizable wreckage in the brush, they did not expect to find anyone breathing. They had to use heavy hydraulic rescue tools, the jaws of life, and an axe to pry the twisted metal away from the shattered windshield just to reach the driver. He was conscious. He was completely trapped. And beneath the dashboard, his right leg had been entirely, fundamentally destroyed. The emergency trauma room at Harbor UCLA Medical Center was not a place of quiet, measured surgery. It was a chaotic theater of desperate salvage. The orthopedic trauma surgeon stood over the table, staring at the catastrophic damage to the right leg. The tibia and fibula, the two load-bearing pillars of the lower leg, were not simply broken. They were heavily comminuted. They were shattered into multiple, jagged, disconnected fragments. The bone had violently pierced the skin, leaving open, bleeding compound fractures. His ankle and foot were deeply crushed, the intricate architecture of small bones completely pulverized. In the sterile, bright glare of the surgical lights, a single, terrifying word hung in the air. A word that no elite athlete, let alone a man whose entire existence was predicated on absolute physical balance, is ever prepared to hear. Amputation. The medical team debated whether the leg could even be saved. The damage was so severe, the lack of blood flow so critical, that removing the leg below the knee was a very real, actively discussed option on the table. They decided to fight the abyss. They cut deep into the muscle fascia to relieve the immense, crushing pressure building inside the leg. They took a long, heavy metal rod and drove it straight down to the hollow center of his shattered tibia, anchoring the bone fragments from the inside. They drilled thick surgical screws into his foot. They bolted heavy titanium plates to his ankle. They essentially rebuilt the lower half of his body, using the crude, industrial materials of a hardware store. He survived. The leg remained attached. But survival in the trauma ward is merely the first bloody down payment on a debt that takes years to pay off. When he finally returned to his sprawling estate in Florida, the billionaire god of golf was reduced to absolute, humiliating helplessness. He could not climb the stairs to his own bedroom. A temporary hospital bed was brought into the center of his living room, transforming his luxurious sanctuary into a sterile, depressing medical ward. For 3 agonizing, suffocating months, he was completely bedridden. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the high ceilings of his mansion, entirely unable to move. The man who used to prowl the fairways of Augusta with the predatory grace of a jungle cat could not even roll over to reach a glass of water without a searing, blinding shock of pain tearing through his titanium-laced leg. But the most excruciating torture did not happen during the day, when the physical therapists were there to distract him. It happened in the dead of night. In the deep, silent hours of the morning, when the heavy prescription painkillers began to inevitably wear off, the shattered nerves of his right leg would suddenly, violently wake up. Without any warning, the damaged muscle tissue would misfire. His entire leg, wrapped in heavy bandages, pinned with iron and screws, would begin to spasm and convulse involuntarily. Night tremors. He would lie in the dark, gritting his teeth, gripping the heavy sheets with white knuckles, forced to watch his own limb thrash and violently contract against his will. Think about the profound, devastating psychological cruelty of that moment. For his entire life, Tiger Woods had demanded absolute, flawless obedience from every single muscle fiber in his body. He commanded, and the body executed perfectly. Now, staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, his body was completely mocking him. The shattered leg trembling in the dark was a brutal, undeniable reminder that he was no longer the master of his own vessel. He was merely a hostage trapped inside a failing mechanical prison. He endured the bed sores. He endured the physical therapy that felt like fresh torture every single morning. He forced himself upright. He learned how to walk on a leg that felt like a block of burning lead. He clawed his way back to a standing position because the alternative, surrender, was the one concept his father had never programmed into his mind. But the universe, it seemed, was determined to strip away every single layer of armor he possessed. The heavy metal in his spine and his right leg had fundamentally altered his biomechanics. When you fuse the back and bolt the leg, the immense physical stress of walking and swinging a golf club simply travels to the next weakest point in the chain. By the spring of 2025, the chain was about to snap again. But this time, as he braced for yet another surgery, the universe was not aiming for his bones. It was aiming directly for the absolute core of his soul. The physical anchor was about to tear, and the emotional anchor was about to permanently disappear. When you bolt a shattered tibia together with heavy titanium, and you replace a collapsing lumbar disc with artificial plastic, the kinetic energy of a violent athletic motion does not simply disappear. It has to go somewhere. The human body is an interconnected biomechanical chain. If the spine cannot flex and the lower leg cannot absorb a shock, the sheer, crushing force of a golf swing simply travels down the bone until it finds the next vulnerable piece of tissue. It finds the Achilles tendon. There's an almost unbearably cruel, poetic irony in the anatomy of the foot. The Achilles tendon is the thickest, strongest fibrous cord in the entire human body, designed to bear the explosive force of a sprinting stride or a sudden leap. It is named, of course, after the invincible Greek hero who was bathed in the river Styx, rendering him completely indestructible, save for the one fragile point on his heel. By March of 2025, the modern demigod of golf had found his fatal flaw. The heavy, dragging gait required to protect his pulverized right leg had placed an unsustainable, tearing strain on his tendon. The tissue began to fray. He was forced once again to walk through the sliding glass doors of a surgical center. Inside a highly specialized orthopedic hospital in West Palm Beach, Florida, the heavy smell of sterile iodine and clinical bleach filled the air. Dr. Charlton Stuken, the chief of orthopedics, performed the repair. The medical press release called it a minimally invasive procedure. They claimed it was highly successful, promising a full recovery. But when you are 50 years old and your body resembles a battlefield of surgical scars, there's absolutely no such thing as a minimal invasion. He woke up with his lower leg locked into a heavy, rigid medical walking boot. The man who had spent his entire life wearing custom-fitted, feather-light athletic shoes was now dragging a clunky, plastic, and Velcro cage across the hardwood floors of his Jupiter Island estate. The rehabilitation was a tedious, mind-numbing grind. Every single morning, he had to sit on the edge of his bed, listening to the heavy click, click, scuff of the mechanical boot as he forced himself to relearn the absolute basics of human movement. He was not training to win a major championship. He was simply fighting for the right to walk across his own living room without wincing. He put his head down. He endured the physical therapy. He swallowed the bitter pill of his decaying biology, believing that if he just put in the hours, if he just pushed through the burning ache in his heel and the phantom spasms in his leg, he could rebuild the machine one last time. But he was fighting a war on the wrong front. He was so obsessively focused on repairing the physical architecture of his body that he did not see the universe taking aim at the absolute, foundational bedrock of his soul. On February 4th, 2026, the earth completely dropped out from beneath his feet. His mother, Kultida Woods, breathed her last. To the public, Kultida was a quiet, intense woman in the oversized sunglasses who followed her son from outside the gallery ropes. But to him, she was the ultimate, impenetrable shield against a terrifying world. When his father, Earl, passed away in 2006, Tiger lost his compass, the architect who built his swing. But when Kultida passed away, he lost his gravity. She was the one who had commanded him to be ruthless. She was the one who stared down his competitors. Even when the world turned its back on him in 2009, when the sponsors fled and the tabloids tore his private life to shreds, Kultida stood by him with iron, unapologetic loyalty. She was the only person on the entire planet who did not look at him and see a billion-dollar corporate asset. She looked at him and saw her son. Now she was gone. The silence that settled over his sprawling, hyper-secure estate on Jupiter Island was absolute and deafening. He was 50 years old. He possessed more wealth than most small nations. He had achieved a level of historical immortality that would be etched into granite for centuries. And he was entirely, terrifyingly alone. He released a brief, hollow statement to press, announcing that he was indefinitely postponing his return to professional tour. He told the world that he was not ready to return to the golf course. It was the most heartbreakingly understated sentence he had ever spoken. He was not just unready for golf. He was unready to face a universe that no longer contained the woman who had protected him from it. Grief is a heavy, suffocating blanket. When you are surrounded by family, you can sometimes push the blanket off for a few hours. But when you isolate yourself behind high security gates, when you lock the doors and pace the empty, echoing halls of a mansion, the blanket wraps itself tightly around your throat. The physical pain in his back, the throbbing ache in his Achilles, and the metallic stiffness in his right leg suddenly amplified by 1,000%. Because physical pain is always magnified by absolute emotional desolation. When your heart is entirely broken, the body completely loses its tolerance for suffering. He was trapped. He could not swing a golf club to release the pressure. He could not run. He could barely walk. The only escape left available to a man imprisoned by his own failing flesh is to completely numb the mind that commands it. When the physical pain in your shattered leg is screaming, when the artificial disc in your spine is throbbing, and when the deafening silence of a house without your mother becomes completely unbearable, you reach for the only switch that can turn the noise off. You reach into the dark and swallow a tiny capsule of synthetic relief. You chase a chemical veil, hoping it will drop a heavy, pharmaceutical quiet over the wreckage of your life. But synthetic peace is an illusion. It does not heal the grief. It merely disconnects the steering wheel from the tires. It was late March of 2026. Just weeks after he had buried his mother, the walls of the Jupiter Island mansion were closing in. He could not sit still. He could not sleep. The night tremors in his leg were firing. Driven by a suffocating, claustrophobic panic, he needed to move. He needed to feel the sensation of forward momentum, even if his own two legs could barely carry him to the driveway. He climbed into the heavy leather seat of his Range Rover. He turned the key. What followed was the final, devastating collapse of the demigod. He drove out into the Florida night, his mind completely submerged under a heavy, synthetic fog. He was not navigating the road. He was drifting through the deep, unresolved trauma of his own existence. The Range Rover collided heavily with a passenger car. The violent impact sent a massive SUV rolling over, tumbling across the pavement, metal scraping violently against the asphalt until it finally ground to a terrifying halt. For the third time in his life, he was trapped inside the crushed steel of an overturned vehicle. When the Martin County Sheriff's deputies arrived, the scene they captured on their body cameras was not a portrait of a defiant, untouchable athletic king. It was a portrait of a broken, grieving orphan. The piercing, aggressive strobe of the red and blue police lights cut through the humid night air, illuminating the deep tragedy of his reality. He was pulled from the wreckage. He was shivering. His eyes, usually locked in that famous predatory Sunday glare, were completely glassy and bloodshot. His pupils were massively dilated under the harsh glow of the flashlights. The officers administered the breathalyzer. He blew triple zeros. He had not consumed a single drop of alcohol. He was drowning in something far more insidious, the desperate, medicated attempt to quiet a body that had been systematically tortured for the entertainment of the world. The officer stepped forward. The heavy, cold iron of the handcuffs clicked brutally shut around his wrists. The hands that had hoisted 15 major championship trophies, the hands that had slipped into the iconic green jacket at Augusta, the hands that had accumulated a billion-dollar fortune, were now pinned behind his back by local law enforcement. He looked at the deputy, his voice trembling, utterly stripped of its imperial command. "I'm being arrested?" It is a question that breaks the heart of anyone who has ever watched a giant fall. It was a confused, terrified whisper of a boy who had been promised by his father that if he just played the game perfectly, he would be completely untouchable. The ride to the county jail was a masterclass in human indignity. Sitting in the back of the heavy police cruiser, draped in a cheap, thin, humiliating sheet to ward off the cold, Tiger Woods could not stop hiccuping. It was an involuntary, spasmodic reaction of a nervous system entirely in shock. He leaned his head back against the hard plastic partition. He closed his eyes. Every time the cruiser hit a bump in the road, he winced, his face twisting in a silent, agonizing grimace as the heavy titanium in his right leg and the artificial disc in his spine violently protested. He was entirely exposed. For days later, the PR machine attempted to salvage the wreckage. A statement was released to the press. Behind closed doors, sources whispered that the great Tiger Woods was embarrassed and ashamed. He announced that he was stepping away from the world, fleeing the United States entirely to check himself into a remote, overseas treatment facility. He was running away. Consider the ultimate, devastating irony of his existence. For his entire life, the objective of his profession was singular and absolute. Hit a small sphere out of the thick grass, out of the deep sand traps, and guide it safely into a perfect manicure hole. He was the greatest escape artist in the history of sports. But as he sits in a treatment facility thousands of miles away from the golf course, surrounded by the ghosts of his parents and trapped inside a skeletal structure held together by surgical screws, the tragic truth is undeniable. He can manipulate a golf ball out of any trap on earth, but he cannot find a way out of the prison of his own failing flesh. The green cage has finally locked its doors. Tiger Woods was engineered to be a god, but the universe demands a spectacular, bloody ransom for divinity. He gave the world absolute perfection. In return, the world took his marriage, his public dignity, his spinal cord, his right leg, and ultimately, the mother who stood as his final shield. He is 50 years old. He has won everything there is to win, and he has absolutely nothing left to hit. Here is a question for those of you who have lived long enough to watch the seasons change, who have felt the inevitable ache in your own joints, or stood by the graves of the parents who raised you. How do you find peace when the illusion of control is finally ripped from your hands? When a body you relied on your entire life begins to rebel, how do you learn to forgive yourself for simply being human? Share your stories and your hard-won wisdom in the comments below. We are reading every single one. If this journey into the cost of greatness moved you, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Because every legend casts a shadow, and we are here to walk through them with you. Until next time, be kind to yourselves